to say a very big welcome to everyone that is joining us from all around the world on this show. Today, my guest is joining me from Harare, Zimbabwe. He's a lawyer and a former lecturer in constitutional and public international law in the Department of Political and Administrative Studies at the University of Zimbabwe. He holds a BL, LLB, MSc IRA from the University of Zimbabwe, LLM, Constitutional Law from London. He is the author of Constitutional Law of Zimbabwe. Ladies and gentlemen, our viewers, the topic under discussion today is the implications of Amendment Bill number 2 coming into law and the future of democracy in Zimbabwe. Before we begin our conversation today, let me give our highly esteemed guest an opportunity, of course, to give us his opening remarks. Mr. Linington, welcome to Africa in Perspective Conversations with David.
Thank you very much, David. It's very nice to be here with you and nice to see you again. And I look forward to this interesting discussion. Really two aspects to this: the procedure or lack of correct procedure behind the amendments, and then the content of the amendments themselves. So we can sort of discuss these two aspects.
Wonderful. Maybe before we get into the gist of the whole discussion, Mr. Linington, you are a constitutional law expert as far as I know. And you know, sometimes we assume everyone knows the basics, such as what is the Constitution, and of course, what is this whole amendment bill. But that is not the case always. So maybe for the benefit of somebody that is watching that doesn't have that knowledge of, first and foremost, what is the Constitution? Secondly, what is this amendment bill? Maybe for the benefit of those people, could you just start by defining a Constitution and of course go on to also define for us what is this whole amendment bill number 2?
Yes, thank you very much. A constitution is a country's supreme law. Most countries have written constitutions. There are a few exceptions. Britain, Israel, New Zealand don't have written constitutions, but most countries do. And Zimbabwe is one of the countries with a written constitution. The constitution is sovereign and supreme. So Parliament, President, all state organs, the people of Zimbabwe are all under the Constitution. In other words, they have to comply with the provisions of the Constitution. Yes, the Constitution authorizes Parliament to amend the Constitution, but in exercising the power conferred upon it by the Constitution, Parliament must follow the procedures laid down in the Constitution and can only change provisions if authorized to do so by the Constitution. And most constitutions, including Zimbabwe's, require a special supermajority procedure in order to change or amend the Constitution. Ordinary bills, ordinary legislation just require a simple majority of those voting in Parliament, but amending the Constitution normally requires a special supermajority, say 2/3, which is the case in Zimbabwe, and sometimes in addition, there's a requirement that the electorate approve an amendment through a referendum as well.
Wonderful. So you have defined for us what a constitution is, and you have taken us through the process of maybe trying to amend the Constitution. But maybe you could also try maybe to also illuminate on the aspect of this bill. What is this bill? Bill amendment number 2. What is it all about? What does it seek to achieve?
Well, a number of things. Quite a few provisions are being amended. And I think you're aware, many lawyers, many civil rights activists are very, very unhappy about this amendment bill.
Yes.
There are two reasons for that. First of all, people are concerned with the procedure followed in purportedly enacting these amendments. Now, Section 328 of the Constitution says that the precise terms of a bill amending the Constitution must be made public by the Speaker 90 days before the bill is introduced into Parliament. But sadly, what has happened with this bill is that the minister and even backbench MPs, in many instances, proposed amendments after the bill had been introduced into Parliament, which makes a nonsense of this 90-day requirement. The reason we have the 90-day requirement is that it's recognized that the Constitution is the supreme law.
Yes.
It's not something you change lightly. Therefore, there should be a public debate, discussion, before Parliament proceed with the bill. But incredibly, with this bill, both the minister and backbench MPs were proposing amendments during the legislative process while this bill was in Parliament. So there was no chance at all for members of the public to comment or discuss or debate. Some of these proposed changes were proposed minutes or on the same day that the vote took. So there wasn't much thought behind these changes. And the result is some of them seem very half-baked, ill-considered, ill-thought out. So it's a failure to comply with Section 328, which is a serious problem procedurally. Then, turning to the content of the amendments, many people are concerned that these are going to have an adverse impact on constitutionalism in Zimbabwe. First of all, we're going back to the idea of appointed vice presidents. When the new Constitution came into force in 2013, provision was made for vice presidents to be elected, but it was postponed for 10 years after the coming into force of the 2013 Constitution. After the expiry of 10 years, vice presidents were supposed to be elected, just like the president. Now, one of the changes proposed in this, or in fact, it's now been enacted in this Amendment Act, is that now vice presidents will continue to be appointed. The 10-year period, which is only supposed to be interim, is now being made permanent, so there are not going to be any elected vice presidents. Much more serious than that, however, are provisions with the judiciary. I think these effectively undermine the independence of the judiciary. Normally, judges are promoted from the High Court to the Supreme Court or to the Constitutional Court, have to go through an interview process by the Judicial Service Commission. The effect of the amendment is now that the president can appoint these judges without going through the interview process. Judges from the High Court, the Labor Court, Administrative Court, Supreme Court can all be promoted by the president unilaterally without going through interviews by the JSC. And I think this is cause for concern. Now, another thing about the judiciary now is that judges are supposed to retire at the age of 70.
Yes.
The Chief Justice is coming up for retirement shortly. He's reaching that age.
Yes.
One of the provisions in this bill introduced into Parliament was that judges reaching the age of 70 would be able to have their term extended by a year and up to 75 years. So every year, it will be extended possibly by 1 year with the permission of the president until you reach 75. That was the bill introduced into Parliament. However, while before Parliament, backbench MPs changed it to make it a single 5-year term. So there'd be no year-by-year thing from 70 onwards. It would be a single 5-year term. That was what was introduced by Parliament. No time for any public debate. This was not subject to 90-day procedure. It was a change proposed during the legislative process in Parliament. I think it falls foul of Section 328 because of the failure to declare precisely the terms of an amendment 90 days before it is introduced. So my point is that you cannot make substantive amendments to constitutional amendment bills during the legislative process, because otherwise that makes nonsense. 90-day period, which the public is allowed to discuss and debate these changes. Remember, we're not just talking about an ordinary parliamentary bill. We're talking about amending or the supreme law of the land, which contains the values, which provides for independence of the judiciary. It's not something to be done in 5 minutes. How can something be proposed in Parliament and that very day it's voted on? I mean, even MPs don't have a chance to really discuss it or think about it properly. So that's for real concern. There are many other provisions as well. For example, the 2013 Constitution provides for special provision for women MPs,
Yes.
Elected by proportional representation.
Yes.
So that there'll be a number of women MPs. Now, this is going to continue. That's also one of the changes. That was due to expire. It's going to continue. But while the bill was before Parliament, again, backbench MPs proposed that this be changed so that the women MPs be under the age of 35. No public debate on that. Mm-hmm. And what happens when women go beyond 35? Does that mean they automatically lose their seats? No one had thought about that. Again, a very half-baked proposal. So this is really cause for concern, then, to make my point.
Yes. No, thank you so much. Yeah, of course, there are a lot of those amendments. There are quite a lot. It's a lot. I'm sure there's also the issue to do with the youth quota. A number of issues that I think we are going also to look into. But maybe just to answer the second question, Mr. Linington, could you also answer the question that what are the implications? What are the implications of these constitutional amendments? Because when you look at it, it speaks a lot on our democracy. It speaks a lot on the future of our democracy. Yes. It speaks a lot on the aspect of separation of powers, checks and balances, civil and political rights. So I don't know, what is the implication of all this when it comes to our democracy? What is the future of our democracy like?
Yes, I think it's going to have an adverse impact on democracy, constitutionalism, and human rights within Zimbabwe. First of all, I think that the independence of the judiciary is going to be undermined. The protective function of the JSC has been watered down. That's the Judicial Service Commission. If the president can just appoint certain judges to certain positions unilaterally without an interview process by the JSC, clearly this undermines the independence of the judiciary. I think that the idea of elected vice presidents is very important. Mm-hmm. That's not going to take place now. And I think that really a constitutional state ought to be one where changes to the fundamental law are considered and debated by the public.
Yes.
The public must have a chance of representations. But when you have important changes introduced in Parliament after the bill's been introduced and voted on there and then without any discussion, even by MPs, let alone the public, come on, that's contrary to basic ideas of constitutionalism, no democratic input whatsoever. The public are just being pushed aside. It's as if we're not there. And they're so half-baked as well. You've got to think carefully about these things. Some of these proposed changes, they're now enacted, don't make proper sense. Mm-hmm. There are serious anomalies. You should debate, discuss, you get rid of all the kinks through a long discussion and debate. But if you don't do that, what you have are errors, mistakes, and things that undermine constitutionalism and democracy.
Very true. It undermines constitutionalism, it undermines democracy. And I think this signals a very bad era in our democracy, because when you look at it, just the fact that when you look at already before this whole amendments came into play, we had a scenario where already there are those who would argue that there was no rule of law. Even this way before there was these amendments, there was no rule of law, there was no constitutionalism, and also there were those who also felt themselves they were not independent. If you look at how some judgments were made, maybe when you look at activists, when you look at political prisoners, members of the opposition, some kind of rulings that were made, there was already some position, maybe from lawyers and different people within the civil space that thought that already there was no rule of law, there was no constitutionalism, and our democracy was in tatters. So now I'm just trying to think, now that we have taken this route, is there a way that this can be reversed?
Yes, I think obviously there's going to be a legal challenge to the validity of this amendment, because it seems clear that the provisions of Section 328 of the Constitution were not properly complied with. And if that's the case, then the amendment can be struck down and be declared void. And I think there will be a challenge brought before the Constitutional Court, drawing attention to the fact that there was a failure to comply with Section 328. In addition, I would like to think that regardless of whatever happens in that court decision, if the case is lost, I hope it isn't and it shouldn't be, but if the case is lost, that in the future, if we have a new government one day, that these changes will be undone, that the Constitution will be repaired. You know, the 2013 Constitution had some good things in it, and it's very sad to see some good things now being watered down. It wasn't a perfect Constitution, but in many ways it was better than what we had before, and it's very sad to see some of the good things it had in it now being watered down or even completely destroyed. That's very, very disappointing.
Mr. Linington, I'm also really concerned about the youth who form the bulk of our population. I think all these developments, I think they adversely impact, of course, on everyone, but I think the youth are the most affected because here we are talking about their future, we're talking about their life. And maybe you could also help to illuminate and, of course, shed more light on how these amendments, this whole development affects not only our generation as the youth. Maybe you could shed more light on how this impacts on the young generation, how it impacts on the young people.
Well, I think young people in particular are very forward thinking. They're looking towards a modern constitutional state that protects human rights, that encourages economic development, investment, creation of jobs. The effect of this amendment is going to be to undermine Zimbabwe's position internationally, put us in a bad light, discourage investment. You know, investors look to see, is there the rule of law, the separation of powers, constitutionalism, basic human rights? And these are things which I think are very important to young people, but to all people who are interested in advancing Zimbabwe. So this very retrogressive amendment is certainly going to undermine Zimbabwe in so many ways. I think it's very sad to see the government shooting itself and the people of Zimbabwe, and the young people in particular, in the foot. It's just so incredible and so over the top. There's absolutely no need for the government to do these things. There's nothing positive going to come from any of this for Zimbabwe. So it's a very, 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 very disappointing development. In a constitutional state, we've got to discuss amendments within society as a whole. We should build a consensus before we change the supreme law of the land. And where this is not the case, the impact is usually very, very adverse.
Wonderful. So maybe, Mr. Linington, maybe the one point you could illuminate on is the issue of Zimbabweans as a people, because in a democracy, we are saying that people rule, democrats, people rule, and the people should play a pivotal role in the governance of their country. Maybe, do you feel that Zimbabweans did enough? I understand there was no time, there wasn't much time to do enough to stand against all these amendments and to speak and try to push against it. But do you feel that Zimbabweans did enough? And even right now, I understand the president has already signed it into law. Do you feel that Zimbabweans can still do something about it?
Well, unfortunately, it's now been signed into law. So what can be done now is a challenge before the courts, ultimately the Constitutional Court. Otherwise, it's just a question of bringing civil pressure to bear. Maybe if that fails, then persuade parliamentarians to change or to change the Constitution to remove these amendments. But in the first instance, I think there has to be a Constitutional Court challenge to these amendments. I think that's the first step forward.
Wonderful. And then the other thing that I also want to ask you, sir, is how do we guard against this in the future? Because this seems to be something that is perennial. This seems to be something that is ongoing. The attempt to to hijack the democratic agenda, an attempt to create what I feel has always been an agenda for so many years, to create what some would like to call a one-party system, and a process whereby we get to see a consolidation of power by the ruling party. What do you think we should do? Because also there's a big concern about the legislature, about how the composition of the legislature as things stand, how it has been rendered weak, how it has been made ineffective in its role to guard against these things. Because honestly speaking, this is supposed to be the role and responsibility of the legislature to stand in the way of such kind of things from happening. So maybe my question to you, sir, is, since this is a perennial thing, this seems to be something that is likely to go on. There is likely to be more attempts to make such amendments to the supreme law of the land. How can society, how can the people, how can Zimbabweans guard against this thing from happening in the future?
Well, normally a two-thirds majority requirement in the legislature in many countries is sufficient to ensure that amendments to the Constitution are not made unless there's a broad consensus within society that both the government and the opposition agree, because in many countries, no party ever gets two-thirds of all the seats in the legislature. But unfortunately, in Zimbabwe, the position is that the ruling party has the seats it needs to secure a constitutional amendment. So that particular safeguard, which works well in other countries, doesn't work here, unfortunately, for that very reason. That is very unfortunate. So that is a problem. There was a time when the ruling party didn't have two-thirds. So for some years, unless there was bipartisan agreement, it was not possible to amend the Constitution. But now, in today's situation, the government, for various reasons, it has the number of votes it needs in Parliament. So practically, amending the Constitution is basically almost as easy as passing an ordinary bill, because they've got the number of seats. So that is very, very sad. The two-thirds mechanism, which protects constitutionalism in many countries, doesn't really work effectively here, unfortunately.
Unfortunately indeed. Unfortunately, our polity seems to be rather unique in its own way, but rather in a bad way. Anyway, Mr. Linington, there is a concern right now. There is a big concern. In light of all these developments, there is a concern that the young people in Zimbabwe, they are sinking deep and deep into voter apathy. Young people, they have lost faith in our voting processes. They've lost faith in our electoral process. They have lost faith in this whole aspect of, voting, registering to vote, and then eventually casting their votes come election day. What would you say to the young people there regarding this aspect? Should they give up? What should they do? Because it appears for them, no matter how much times they go to vote, they don't effect any change. Things, they just remain the same. Many, they feel that the election is rigged, and so there is no need to register to vote and maybe try to exercise their democratic right, which is, of course, to vote as a citizen. So what is your advice? What do you say to the young people? Because these are the bulk of the population. What is your advice to them? Should they give up, or should they continue to make effort to register to vote and eventually vote? Because remember, we are left with about a year and a half, if I'm not mistaken. The elections are fast approaching. Yet elections, they're the cornerstone of democracy. They're the cornerstone of democracy. So I don't know, what would be your advice to the young people of Zimbabwe?
Yes, I would say, please don't give up. Things look pretty bleak at the moment, but we've got to keep hope. We've got to move forward. Many countries all over the world have had constitutional crises. The rule of law, constitutionalism, democracy has been threatened. We look around the world today. There are many countries where democracy is under threat. But don't give up, because ultimately I'm sure the will of the people will prevail. constitutionalism and democracy eventually is going to function properly. Everyone should do their duty, register as a voter, and let's see if we can move things forward. It's going to take time, but I think we must all do our best to try to promote a culture of constitutionalism in Zimbabwe. You know, a constitution is just a written document, but what's very important is that the values of constitution have become part of the culture of the people. And I think we need to constantly talk about constitutionalism, democracy, the rule of law, and get it into the bloodstream of society. When this happens, then I think we can see progress and people moving forward, where it's part and parcel of everyone's values. The Scandinavian countries have been good at that, and I think we can learn something from that. So we just need to keep our heads up and keep moving forward and think about constitutionalism and develop a culture of it.
I like the aspect of developing a culture of it, which, in my view, may suggest that, you know, there is somebody that I was interviewing the other day, and he made the remark. He said, "Charity begins at home." So I don't know what would you say regarding constitutionalism, even at political party level? Don't you feel that that's where it's supposed to start from?
Yeah, of course. It's important that political parties respect constitutionalism. They should be leading by example. But sadly, sometimes parties fail. We've seen this in America. I mean, America is supposedly a leading democratic state, and we saw only some months ago the president of the United States trying to undermine his own democratic system. He lost, and he refused to accept the outcome. And Americans pride themselves on being a leading democratic state, but you know, there was democracy under threat. Ultimately, democracy and the will of the people prevailed. Change came about. That's great, but it was certainly under threat. So we've got to accept that there are constitutionalism, but we've got to move forward and just keep focused on the key issues.
Wonderful. Mr. Linington, maybe on the side, I would like to ask you, do you believe that in Zimbabwe we will ever achieve democracy? Do you believe there will come a day that we will achieve a democracy in Zimbabwe?
Yes, I think so. I mean, look, we've seen it in neighboring states where democracy functions properly. Zambia has had political change, different leaders, different parties have followed each other. There's no reason why Zimbabwe shouldn't follow suit. There's nothing in our DNA as Zimbabweans which is actually undemocratic. I mean, Zambia, Malawi, they have elections, changes come about, new people become leaders. Why should we be different in Zimbabwe? So ultimately, I think that democracy and the rule of law are going to function properly. Countries all over the world have these problems. Democracy is a very precious thing. We've got to guard it. It's a fragile thing, and it can easily be threatened and destroyed. It was threatened in America, but the system there was able to overcome it. And we've got to try and do the same here. And ultimately, I'm sure democracy will prevail.
Wonderful. That's very, very promising. Thank you for those kind words, Mr. Linington. Mr. Linington, before I let you go, I would like to give you an opportunity to submit your closing remarks. Maybe you could also provide recommendations, of course, to the government of Zimbabwe, but also, more importantly, maybe some words of encouragement and also even recommendations to the people of Zimbabwe as a way of submitting your closing remarks.
My recommendation to the government of Zimbabwe is please follow the Constitution, respect the rule of law. When you want to amend the Constitution, follow the procedures set out in the Constitution. It's got to be, proposed amendments must be made available to the public 90 days before being introduced into Parliament. That has not been done properly in this instance, and that undermines the legitimacy of this whole exercise, besides being illegal as well. And as I said earlier, for Zimbabweans generally, just engage, don't despair, register as voters. develop your understanding of constitutionalism. There are discouraging moments, but look, there's no reason why we can't move forward. Democracy operates in other African countries, other countries around the world. It's threatened in some places, but we're no different. We should be able to move forward. So I'm sure in the end, however long it takes, we're going to see an improvement in Zimbabwe ultimately.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Linington. It was so good having you on the show. Until we meet again, it is a bye-bye for now, but I look forward to host you again. We have learned a lot today, and we look forward to drink from those wealthy bowels of wisdom. Mr. Linington, thank you so much. Goodbye for now.